An 18-year-old walked into a car dealership with his own money ready to buy his first car. They kicked him out without a second thought. The next day, his father, Michael Jordan, showed up and made sure they never forgot his name. Jeffrey Jordan had his entire day planned out. It was a warm afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, the air thick with that humid buzz just before a summer downpour. Jeffrey didn't mind. He wore a black hoodie gray joggers and a pair of scuffed Air Jordans that had seen better days. Tucked under his arm was a sleek black folder with 5 printed listings used SUVs, all under $50,000, all with solid mileage. He wasn't there to flex. He just wanted something reliable for his new chapter. Jeffrey had just finished his business degree at the University of Central Florida and was gearing up to launch a startup in Chicago. He needed a car to handle the drives between cities. Nothing flashy, just something that wouldn't stall on I-94. So when he stepped through the glass doors of Elite Motors, a polished dealership just off the interstate, his vibe was cool-focused. He even paused to hold the door for a guy walking out. The guy nodded thanks. The receptionist behind the desk didn't look up. "Can I help you?" she asked, eyes glued to her screen. "Yeah, I'm here to check out some SUVs you've got listed," Jeffrey replied, lifting the folder slightly. "I printed them out. There's a couple of Explorers and a Jeep I saw online." The woman blinked once, then said, "Are you here with your parents?" "No, ma'am," Jeffrey said. "I'm buying it myself." She gave him a tight smile and waved toward the lot. "Someone will be out shortly." But no one came. Jeffrey waited by the sliding glass doors, glancing outside. He could see the cars lined up clean, gleaming. The Jeep was there. He double-checked same VIN as the listing. He stepped outside toward it, then stopped when a tall man in khakis and a red Elite Motors polo shirt walked up, cutting him off. "You lost?" the man asked. He held a clipboard but didn't look at it. His eyes were on Jeffrey's hoodie, his shoes. "No. I'm here for a car," Jeffrey said again, holding out the folder. The salesman didn't glance at it. "Well, this isn't a place to hang around if you're not serious. We've had incidents lately." "Incidents?" Jeffrey repeated, confused. "People coming around checking out cars they can't afford, taking photos, causing issues. You understand?" Jeffrey felt something twist in his gut, but he kept his voice steady. "I printed out a few models from your site. I'm not taking photos. I just want to test drive one." The man gave a forced chuckle. "Why don't you come back with a parent or someone who can talk financing?" "I don't need a parent. I'm paying cash." "My name's on the account," Jeffrey said. "I've already talked to my bank about it." "Look," the man said, backing up a step. "I'm not trying to be rude, all right? It's just people get ideas, and right now I don't have time for that." Jeffrey didn't move. He just stared at the man, his folder still in his hands, now damp with sweat. "So you want me to leave?" "I'm saying we're busy today. You can come back another time, or better yet, maybe try one of the used lots down the road. They might have something more in your range." There it was. Jeffrey didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just looked down at his folder, then back at the Jeep across the lot and gave the faintest nod, not of agreement, but of understanding. He turned around, walked back to his car, and drove away. But what the staff at Elite Motors didn't know was who Jeffrey Jordan really was. Jeffrey didn't play music on the way home, just silence and the soft hum of his tires on the road as a light rain began to fall. He wasn't the type to vent or lash out. He processed things quietly, sometimes too quietly for his own good. He took the long way back past the basketball courts where he used to shoot hoops with his brothers, past the old sneaker store that still had faded posters of his dad's iconic dunks in the window. Familiar streets, familiar stillness. But this time he felt different, like the ground beneath him wasn't as steady as it used to be. When he pulled into the driveway of their Charlotte estate, he sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, staring out through the rain-speckled glass. Inside, the house smelled like leather and espresso, his dad's two go-to vibes for owning the day. Jeffrey slipped off his shoes at the door, still not saying a word. He walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured himself a glass of water. Michael Jordan was upstairs wrapping up a call with his business team. Jeffrey could hear the deep, commanding rhythm of his voice from the home office. Calm, confident, the kind of tone that could close a deal or quiet a room. Michael was the kind of man who could dominate an NBA court one day and negotiate a billion-dollar brand the next. When he came downstairs later that evening, he found Jeffrey in the living room, sitting on the couch, laptop open folder by his side. "Find anything you liked?" Michael asked. Jeffrey hesitated, then said, "I went to Elite Motors. They had some decent stuff." Michael sat down across from him. "You test drive anything?" "No." Michael tilted his head slightly. "Why not?" "They told me to come back with a parent. Said I looked like I was just hanging around," Jeffrey said casually, like he was reading off a stat sheet. Michael's jaw tightened. Not anger, just a pause, a deliberate pause. "Did something happen?" Jeffrey shook his head. "It's whatever. I wasn't going to start anything there. I left." Michael watched him carefully. "Did they say something specific?" "Not really. Just kind of treated me like I didn't belong." Michael didn't say much after that. He just leaned forward, rested his hand on Jeffrey's shoulder for a second, then got up and started messing with the coffee machine. But his mind was elsewhere. Jeffrey returned to his laptop, scrolling through listings. His bank account was still open in another tab. He had enough, he knew that. And yet he'd never felt smaller. He didn't know it, but upstairs in his office, Michael was already making moves. Michael wasn't the type to storm in and trash a place that wasn't his game. He believed in precision and hitting where it counted. If he spoke, it was because he had to, and when he did, people paid attention. That night, he made one call to a friend who ran a sports marketing firm that had ties to Elite Motors. Nothing heavy. Just a few questions about their owner, their staff who handled customer walk-ins. By morning, he had everything he needed. Jeffrey was still asleep when Michael backed the Bugatti Chiron out of the garage. He didn't drive it often. It was more a statement than a daily ride, a gift from a luxury brand he'd partnered with years ago. He'd almost sold it once, but his own father had told him to keep it. Sometimes people need to see what winning looks like, especially the ones who think they've already figured you out. As the car rolled onto the main road, its matte black finish caught the morning sun like a quiet flex. This wasn't about showing off, it was about showing up. It was barely 9:30 a.m. when the double doors at Elite Motors slid open again. Same lobby, same woman behind the front desk typing away, lost in her screen. But this time it wasn't Jeffrey. The first thing she noticed was the car, the kind you don't forget. Matty black Bugatti, custom rims, North Carolina plates. The kind of ride you don't expect to see parked outside a mid-tier dealership in Charlotte. The second thing she noticed was the man stepping out. Michael Jordan didn't need to say a word to own a room. He walked in wearing a tailored gray suit, sneakers that didn't make a sound, and no jewelry except a simple watch. No smile, no scowl, just presence, the kind that makes people sit up straighter without knowing why. "Good morning," Michael said. The receptionist blinked. "Good morning. Are you here for a service appointment?" "No," he said, setting his keys gently on the counter. "I'd like to speak with the manager." "Sure, one moment." She picked up the phone, dialing fast, her eyes flicking to the Bugatti outside. In less than a minute, a man appeared, mid-40s, tucked-in dress shirt, Bluetooth in one ear. He looked like he was always rushing between calls. "I'm Dan Grissom, general manager here," he said, extending his hand. "What can I help you with today?" Michael didn't take the handshake. "You had an interaction with my son yesterday. 18 years old. Black, quiet. Wore a hoodie, brought printouts of several used vehicles. You told him to leave." Dan's face twitched, but he kept his professional smile. "Man, I meet a lot of people. It's possible there was some misunderstanding." Michael opened Jeffrey's black folder and placed it flat on the counter. He walked in with this. "He showed your staff exactly which models he came for. He had financing pre-approved and was prepared to pay cash. He left without a test drive. Know why?" Dan's smile thinned. "There's no need to make this confrontational." "It's not." Michael cut in evenly. "It's informational." Dan exhaled. "Look, if he felt disrespected, I'm happy to offer him a second visit. Maybe I can walk him through inventory myself. That won't be necessary." Dan looked confused. "Then how can I make this right?" Michael picked up the folder, opened it, and held up one of the listings. "You see this Jeep here? Your staff told him it was out of his range. You assumed he didn't belong. You didn't know who he was. But that's not the problem." He flipped the paper down gently. "The problem is, even if he was just a kid with a dream and not a bank account, he still deserved respect. Dan shifted, finally breaking eye contact. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a single business card, black, embossed with his name in gold. Michael Jordan, Chairman, Jordan Brand. Next time a young man walks in with that kind of preparation, I suggest you ask about his name before you assume his value, he said. You never know who you're turning away. For a second, the room went still. The receptionist stopped typing. Another salesman paused at the door to the lot. Michael looked Dan in the eye. And just so you know, I didn't come here because my son asked me to. He didn't even want me to. He told me not to make it a big deal. But that's the difference between him and me. He gives grace. I give reminders. Dan swallowed hard. Michael adjusted his keys in his hand and turned toward the exit. Oh, and the car outside, he said over his shoulder, not for sale. Just a visual aid. He walked out without waiting for a reply. But the conversation inside wasn't over, not for Dan. Not for anyone who'd seen him come in. Dan didn't move for a full 30 seconds after the door closed. His ears burned, not from embarrassment, but from realization. He wasn't new to this gig. He'd been in the business long enough to know when someone came in looking for drama, and when someone came in with truth. And Michael Jordan had brought the second one. Behind him, the receptionist whispered, "Was that his son yesterday?" "The kid Dan didn't answer. In his office, he sat down, clicked his pen a few times, and stared at his desk. Then he called in the salesman who'd turned Jeffrey away, the same guy with the red Elite Motors polo. Chris closed the door. Chris looked uneasy. "What's up? You remember that kid from yesterday? Black teenager said he wanted to look at SUVs?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, the one hanging around the Jeep." Dan folded his hands. He wasn't hanging around. He had paperwork, printed listings, pre-approved. His father came in this morning. Chris scoffed lightly. "Okay, but, I mean, he looked like Dan cut him off. He looked like what?" Chris paused, mouth slightly open, but no words came. Dan leaned back. "You ever thought maybe we don't get a lot of black customers in here because they walk in, see how we look at them, and walk right back out?" Chris squirmed in his seat. "It's not like that." "You sure?" Dan asked. Because he didn't yell. He didn't ask for anything free. He just wanted us to know who we turned away, not because he was poor, but because we assumed he was. Chris stared at the floor. Dan pointed at the window that looked out onto the lot. "Every week we complain about online competition and people wasting our time, but maybe we're wasting our own opportunities by deciding who's worth our effort before they even speak." Chris didn't say anything else, just stood there, probably thinking back on all the other young guys he'd brushed off with the same tired lines. Meanwhile, back at home, Jeffrey was still in bed, earbuds, and rewatching a video about startup funding strategies. His morning was quiet. He had no idea his father had already walked back into the very place that shut him out. And he didn't need to. Michael hadn't gone there for props. He did it because he'd seen it happen before. Michael's own memories came back as he drove home, not from anger, but from something deeper. From the time he was a rookie in the NBA, when a sponsor assumed he was just a face, not a mind. Or when he pitched his first shoe deal, and half the room only talked to his agent. Or when he sat in boardrooms, and someone asked if he was just there for the photo op. It didn't matter how many rings he had, some people only saw what they wanted to. He wasn't trying to shield Jeffrey from that, he couldn't. But he could make sure someone remembered the next time they tried it. That afternoon, while Michael was on another call with his team, Dan at Elite Motors sent an internal memo. Nothing dramatic, just a note reminding the staff of the dealership's values and the importance of treating every person, no matter how they look, with equal respect. He knew it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And he didn't send it because he feared a lawsuit or a viral post. Michael hadn't even hinted at that. He didn't have to. He'd just spoken truth in a way that stuck. But the person who'd felt it most hadn't even been there to hear it. Michael hadn't always been the man who could walk into a dealership and make grown men freeze mid-sentence. That kind of presence, that kind of weight, it was earned, forged through pressure, sometimes setbacks, and always focus. He remembered hustling on courts in Wilmington as a kid, his mom working late shifts, his dad pushing him to outwork everyone. He was the lanky teen who got cut from varsity, the one people underestimated until he proved them wrong. So he kept his eyes on one thing, building something no one could deny. Jeffrey had grown up with a different life, but Michael made sure he didn't grow up soft. He'd had him breaking down game film by age 12, working charity events when most kids were gaming all weekend, not to make him struggle but to show him the real world beyond the cushioned life he'd built. He also taught him when to push and when to step back. That's why he wasn't shocked when Jeffrey came home the day before quiet and pulled back. He'd learned to hold his frustration not because he was weak, but because he was raised to know silence can hit harder than noise. What got to Michael most, though, was how fast Jeffrey had accepted it, not because he didn't care, but because he was used to it. That thought stuck with him all day. The idea that his son, with his degree, his hustle, and his laid-back grit, had already made peace with being seen as less. Michael remembered when Jeffrey was 11 and a neighbor called the cops on some kid walking through the gated community. That kid was Jeffrey coming back from a friend's house with a basketball and a backpack. He remembered pulling up in his truck, seeing Jeffrey sitting on the curb, not mad, not shaken, just waiting. Even back then, he never told him, but that was the night he upgraded the home security, not to lock people out, but to protect his son from being misjudged. He knew the world wouldn't always give Jeffrey the same respect he'd fought for. That's why he taught him to move like a pro, adaptable, strong, but steady. That's why Jeffrey hadn't argued at the dealership, and that's exactly why Michael had. Later that evening, Jeffrey came downstairs with his backpack and quietly asked, "You still got that list of dealerships you liked better?" Michael didn't say much, just handed him his phone with a saved note titled Better Spots. He hadn't deleted it even after the Bugatti. Jeffrey scrolled through and stopped at one. "Think this one would take me seriously?" Michael paused. "They'd better." Jeffrey smiled faintly, but something shifted in his eyes. He wasn't bitter, just sharper. But what neither of them knew yet was that someone else had been watching their story closer than they thought. The next morning at Elite Motors felt different. No big meeting, no press blast, but something in the air had shifted. The sales floor, usually buzzing with fake grins and small talk, was quieter, not dead, just reflective. Dan, the general manager, had made a call that morning while staring at his coffee. He'd botched it not just with the kid, but with the whole vibe he'd let fester under his watch. The kind of mindset that judged a book by its cover before flipping a page. He walked in earlier than usual in time to catch Chris outside unlocking the Jeep, the same one Jeffrey had wanted to test drive. Dan motioned to it. "Detail this one today. I want it ready to go, tires, battery, everything." Chris gave a half nod. "You think the kid'll come back?" "No," Dan said. "I don't. But it's not about him anymore. It's about what we do next." Meanwhile, Michael had already moved on. He didn't dwell. He didn't tweet about it or call the press. That wasn't his play. He hadn't gone there for clout or chaos. He went to remind them clean and sharp that their blind spots had weight. It was his own dad's voice that came back to him that morning while he sipped espresso in the kitchen. Some people only see what they want until you show them what they missed. Jeffrey, on the other hand, was already texting with a rep from another dealership across town. One that actually answered when he asked questions online, one that didn't flinch when he mentioned a cash buy. He wasn't rushing. He knew what he wanted and what he wouldn't put up with. Later that day, Michael got a call from a number he didn't know. He almost let it go to voicemail, but he picked up. "Mr. Jordan, this is Dan Grissom from Elite Motors." Michael didn't speak right away. "I know you didn't ask for anything," Dan went on, "but I wanted you to know we talked to our team. We're adjusting how we handle walk-ins, especially young ones. We're setting up a training module about bias starting next month. It's not everything, but it's a start." Michael didn't thank him. Not out of shade, just focus. "Make sure it sticks," he said. "I will." A pause. "And tell your son Dan," added, "he left more of an impact than he probably knows." After the call, Michael stood for a moment in the middle of his kitchen, phone in hand. He wasn't the type who needed a pat on the back, but something about that call landed. Not just because someone finally owned up, but because they finally wanted to fix it. That evening, Jeffrey came in from the garage holding a key fob. "Think I'm going with the Explorer," he said. Michael looked up from his tablet. "From the second place?" "Yeah." Jeffrey nodded. "Guy there walked me through everything. No weird energy, just straight talk. Felt different." Michael smiled. "You like it?" "Yeah. It's not loud, but it's solid." "That's you," Michael said. Jeffrey paused, then asked, "Did you say something to them?" Michael leaned back slightly. "I had a conversation." Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. "Like a serious one?" "I wasn't there to yell," Michael said, "just to remind them who they missed." Jeffrey took that in, then smiled slow, real. "Thanks." Michael shrugged. "You thanked me by not letting it change how you see yourself." But what they both knew without saying it was that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. And sometimes the loudest message comes in the quietest voice. A week later, the Explorer sat in their driveway, its paint still fresh from the dealer's final polish. Jeffrey had already taken it on a few spins. Nothing major, just around town, back roads, a few tight turns to get the feel. He liked how it moved quiet, steady. No spotlight, just results. He didn't talk much about the Elite Motors thing after that, not because he'd forgotten, but because it didn't shape the win. The lesson had already sunk in like ink on a playbook, absorbed, not erased. Michael noticed it too in small ways. The way Jeffrey carried himself when they went out, the way he triple-checked his accounts before signing, the way he asked if he should wear a button-up when they hit another dealership later that month to help his cousin scope out a pickup. He wasn't trying to be someone else, he was just adjusting like Michael had so many times before. They never needed a big sit-down talk. That wasn't their style. Their bond lived in the margins, in the glance across the room, the quiet nod when something heavy went unsaid. One evening, while Jeffrey was helping his cousin practice parallel parking, Michael sat at his desk, flipping through some endorsement contracts. His eyes landed on a photo pinned to the wall, Jeffrey at age 10, holding up a Youth League trophy, grinning in a jersey 2 sizes too big. Behind him was the family's old Suburban, the one Michael had driven through his early NBA days. It wasn't the trophy that made him grin, it was the look in Jeffrey's eyes. He'd always had that spark, and now he had proof, not of money, not of payback, but of knowing who he was, no matter what anyone else thought. A few days later, Michael got an envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note on plain white paper. "We're doing better now because someone reminded us why we have to. Thank you. Elite Motors." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his desk drawer, not because he needed to remember them, but because he wanted to remember that sometimes people can shift if you make them see what they've ignored. That evening, he told Jeffrey about the note. Jeffrey just chuckled and said, "Guess they finally got the memo." Michael looked at him. "You got it a long time ago." Jeffrey shrugged. "Still feels good, though." Michael laughed. "Yeah, it does." Outside, the sun dipped behind the trees across the street, stretching shadows across the driveway. Jeffrey stood by the Explorer for a moment, arms crossed, just looking at it. Then he opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. No music, just motion. No one watching but the people who mattered. And in that moment, it was clear he didn't just get a car. He got something bigger. Self-respect, clarity, the knowledge that quiet strength outlasts noise. That how the world sees you doesn't get to define how you see yourself. That sometimes the best kind of power is walking away without losing your game. Stories like Jeffrey's happen every day, and not all of them have a Bugatti rolling up to the lot. But each one carries a choice for all of us to pause, to rethink, to see people fully before deciding who they are. If this story hit you, if it made you think or reminded you of someone, share it. Let others feel it too. And don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are coming. Stories that speak quietly but hit hard.